Most people peak on someone else's schedule. They hit the milestones when they're supposed to, collect the promotions when the timeline says they should, and settle into a life that looks right from the outside by 35. And some of them are genuinely happy with that. But you're watching this because something about your timeline has never matched theirs. Something about the way your life has unfolded has felt off rhythm, delayed, like you've been preparing for a race nobody else can see. Jung noticed something about these people, the ones who seemed to lag behind in their 20s and 30s, who couldn't quite force themselves into conventional shapes. He found that many of them didn't just eventually catch up, they surpassed. And the mechanism behind why they surpassed had almost nothing to do with talent, luck, or late-blooming confidence. It had to do with what was happening underground during all those years everyone else assumed they were failing. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung actually observed about people who win late, what psychological architecture gets built during those long, invisible years of apparent stagnation, and why the very things that made you feel broken in your 20s might be the foundation of something most people never get to build at all. There's an uncomfortable truth that nobody in the self-help world wants to say out loud. Early success and deep self-knowledge almost never coexist. You can have one or the other. You can climb fast and figure out who you are later, usually through some kind of crisis in your 40s. Or you can spend the early years doing the slow, unglamorous work of understanding yourself and watch everyone around you race ahead while you're still trying to figure out what you actually want. Jung saw both types walk through his door. The early achievers showed up in midlife, confused and hollow, wondering why the life they'd built so efficiently felt like it belonged to a stranger. And the late bloomers showed up in their 20s and 30s, panicked because they couldn't seem to get started. What fascinated Jung was that the late bloomers weren't actually behind. They were doing something the early achievers had skipped entirely. They were individuating, becoming psychologically whole, before they built their external lives. Individuation, the way Jung described it, is the process of integrating all the scattered, contradictory parts of yourself into something coherent. The shadow you've been avoiding, the parts of your personality your family told you were too much or not enough, the desires you buried because they didn't match the plan. Most people put this process off. They build careers, relationships, identities, all on top of a foundation they've never actually examined. And for a while, it holds. But Jung kept seeing the same pattern. The unexamined foundation eventually cracks. Sometimes it cracks through divorce, sometimes through burnout, sometimes through a depression that arrives one Tuesday morning for no apparent reason and simply refuses to leave. The structure was never sound because the person who built it didn't know themselves when they were building. The rare ones, the ones who seem behind, are often doing the foundation work first. And foundation work is invisible. You can't post it on social media. You can't put it on a resume. It looks from the outside like you're standing still, or worse, like you're lost. Let's talk about what rare actually means in this context, because it's easy to romanticize the word and miss the reality. When Jung used terms like this, he wasn't flattering anyone. He was describing a psychological minority, people whose inner wiring makes it genuinely difficult to conform to standard developmental timelines. These are people with unusually active inner lives, high sensitivity to meaning, and a stubborn inability to do things that feel psychologically false. They can't just take the job because it pays well. They can't just stay in the relationship because it's convenient. Something in them resists, and that resistance has a cost. The cost is time, years sometimes. You spend your 20s saying no to things that would have moved your life forward on paper because something in you knew they weren't right. You spend your early 30s watching friends buy houses and get promoted while you're still circling the same questions. What do I actually want? What am I really here for? Why can't I just settle like everyone else? And the brutal part, the part Jung was honest about, is that during those years, you often can't tell the difference between meaningful resistance and self-sabotage. They feel identical from the inside. You're saying no, but you don't fully understand what you're saying no to, or why, or whether the refusal is wisdom or cowardice. That ambiguity is part of the process. It's also what makes those years so painful. Jung would have called this the tension of opposites. You're caught between who the world says you should be and who you're becoming, and you can't resolve that tension by simply choosing a side. The resolution comes through a third thing, a synthesis that you can't see yet because it hasn't formed. It's still underground, still taking shape in the dark. So you wait. And the waiting feels like failure. Here's what's actually happening during the waiting, though, and this is the part most people never get told. When you spend years unable to commit to a path that feels false, you're doing something psychologically radical. You're refusing to build on an unfinished foundation. Every person who jumped into the career at 22 without asking whether it was actually theirs, every person who married the first viable partner because the timeline said it was time, they built something. But they built it before they knew who was doing the building. Jung observed that the people who resisted this pattern, sometimes consciously, sometimes through what looked like dysfunction, were the ones who eventually built structures that lasted. Their careers had a coherence that the early achievers' careers often lacked. Their relationships had depth that came from actually knowing what they needed. Their creative work had a quality he described as authentic, meaning it came from the integrated self, not the performing self. But you have to understand what the integrated self actually costs. It costs your 20s, sometimes your 30s. It costs the comfort of feeling normal. It costs the ease of comparing yourself favorably to your peers. It costs the simple pleasure of knowing where your life is going. What you get in exchange is something most people don't acquire until midlife crisis forces it on them, if they acquire it at all. Self-knowledge. Real self-knowledge. The kind that doesn't come from personality tests or therapy buzzwords, but from years of sitting with your own contradictions until you stop being afraid of them. There's a reason Jung focused so much of his later work on the second half of life. He believed, and his decades of observation supported this, that the first half of life is meant for building the ego structure, establishing yourself in the world, creating an identity. The second half is meant for dismantling what's false in that identity and becoming who you actually are. The problem is, most people build the ego structure out of borrowed materials. Their parents' expectations, society's definitions of success, the path of least resistance. They construct a self that works, that gets them through their 20s and 30s. But it's not really theirs. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to navigate the social world. Everyone has one. But for most people, the persona becomes so convincing that they forget it's a mask at all. The rare ones can't forget. That's what makes them rare and what makes their path harder. They can feel the gap between the persona and something deeper, and they can't ignore it. They try. God, do they try. But the gap keeps reasserting itself. It shows up as restlessness, as inability to commit, as the nagging sense that they're living someone else's life, even when they can't articulate whose. So, they either keep trying to force the mask to fit, which leads to anxiety and depression and various forms of self-medication, or they stop trying, which leads to the years of wandering that look, from the outside, like aimlessness. Jung would argue the wandering is the work. You're not lost, you're looking for yourself. And you're doing it the hard way because the easy way, accepting the mask, isn't available to you. Let's get specific about what this looks like in practice, because the psychological language can make it sound more elegant than it feels. Picture someone in their late 20s. They graduated, maybe started a career, maybe didn't finish the degree at all. Their friends are establishing themselves, new apartments, serious relationships, career momentum, and this person is stuck. They've started 3 different things and abandoned all of them. They've had relationships that fizzled because something always felt off. They spend too much time alone, reading or thinking or staring at the wall, trying to understand something they can't even name. Their family is worried. Their friends have started giving advice that sounds like concern but feels like pressure. You just need to pick something and stick with it. You're overthinking this. Sometimes you just have to commit. And the advice isn't wrong, exactly. For most people, it would work. But for this person, committing to the wrong thing feels like a kind of death. A quiet, respectable death that everyone around them would celebrate as maturity. Here's what nobody sees. This person is developing a relationship with their own psyche that most people won't develop until their late 40s, if ever. They're confronting their shadow, the parts of themselves they've been taught to hide, in their 20s instead of waiting for a crisis to force the confrontation. They're asking questions about meaning, authenticity, purpose. The questions Jung said belong to the second half of life, before they've even established themselves in the first half. And that's the paradox. They're doing the deep work early. But because the deep work produces no visible results, everyone, including themselves, thinks they're behind. Jung had a concept he returned to again and again throughout his career that applies directly here. He talked about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to bridge opposing tensions and produce something new. When you're caught between who you are and who you're expected to be, between your inner reality and the external world's demands, the transcendent function is what eventually creates a resolution that honors both sides. But, and this is critical, the transcendent function can't be rushed. It operates on its own timeline. You can create the conditions for it: self-reflection, honesty, willingness to sit with discomfort. You can even do things that support it: therapy, creative work, journaling, meaningful solitude. But you cannot force the synthesis to arrive before it's ready. This is what the rare ones are doing during their years of apparent stagnation. They're holding the tension. They're refusing to resolve it prematurely by just picking a side. And that refusal, which everyone around them interprets as indecision, is actually an act of psychological courage. They're trusting a process they can't see or prove or explain to anyone who asks what they're doing with their lives. The synthesis, when it finally arrives, tends to arrive all at once. After years of circling, something clicks. The career makes sense suddenly. The creative vision crystallizes. The relationship that actually fits shows up. Or, more accurately, they finally become the person who can recognize it when it does. And because they've done the foundational work, the thing they build isn't fragile. It doesn't need constant maintenance or external validation to hold together. It's built on self-knowledge, which means it's built on bedrock. This is why late wins tend to be lasting wins. Early success is often built on talent plus conformity, and conformity expires. Late success is built on integration, and integration compounds. If what you've been hearing resonates, if you felt that gap between what the world expects and what something deeper in you keeps insisting on, you might find real use in our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's actual teachings, built for exactly this kind of inner work. The kind that doesn't produce Instagram posts, but does produce the foundation everything else eventually gets built on. The link's below whenever you're ready. Let's keep going. There's another dimension to this that Jung explored extensively, and it's one that rarely gets discussed: the role of suffering in psychological development. Jung didn't romanticize suffering. He wasn't interested in pain for its own sake. But he observed consistently that the people who developed the deepest psychological resources were the ones who had been forced to struggle with themselves, their contradictions, their wounds, their unresolved material for extended periods. Suffering that leads to consciousness was, in his framework, qualitatively different from suffering that leads to bitterness. The difference wasn't in the suffering itself, but in whether the person metabolized it or just endured it. The rare ones metabolize. They don't just go through hard things, they extract meaning from hard things. The failed relationship becomes data about what they actually need. The career dead end becomes clarity about what they'll never compromise on again. The years of feeling lost become a map of their inner landscape that's more detailed than anything they could have drawn in times of ease. This is what Jung meant when he talked about turning lead into gold, the alchemical metaphor he was so fond of. The raw material of psychological development is often pain, confusion, apparent failure. The gold is the consciousness that emerges when that raw material gets worked with rather than avoided. And here's the part that stings. You can't acquire this kind of consciousness on a comfortable timeline. You can't metabolize what you haven't experienced. The very difficulties that make the rare person's 20s and 30s so painful are the raw material for the psychological sophistication that makes their 40s, 50s, and beyond so powerful. Let me address something directly, because if you're living this, you've probably heard it already. People will tell you that you're overthinking, that you're too much in your head, that you need to stop analyzing and just live. And they're telling you this with genuine concern. They can see you struggling and they want it to stop. But what they're really saying is, be more like us, process less, accept more, lower your standards for self-knowledge and just function. And for certain kinds of people, that advice is helpful. For the rare ones, it's poison. Because the rare ones aren't overthinking. They're thinking at the depth their psyche requires. They're processing at the speed their complexity demands. Asking them to stop is like asking a deep-rooted tree to grow shallow roots because the shallow-rooted trees leafed out first. Jung himself went through a period like this. After his break with Freud, he spent years in what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period that looked from the outside like a breakdown. He was having visions. He was talking to figures in his imagination. He was filling notebooks with material that any reasonable colleague would have called psychotic. He later described this period as the most important of his life. Everything he built afterward, every major concept, every therapeutic breakthrough, emerged from those years of apparent dissolution. He wasn't breaking down, he was breaking through, but nobody could tell the difference at the time, including, at moments, himself. So what happens when the rare ones finally emerge? What does winning late actually look like? It doesn't look like a sudden explosion of success, usually. It looks like a quiet arrival, a settling into yourself that changes everything without changing anything dramatic on the surface. You take a job, but this time you take it because it aligns with something true in you, and the alignment gives you energy instead of draining it. You enter a relationship, but this time you enter it as a whole person, and the relationship becomes a partnership instead of a rescue mission. The external markers might come: career success, creative recognition, financial stability. But the real shift is internal. You stop comparing your timeline to anyone else's. You stop apologizing for the years that looked empty. You start to see that those years were the densest years of your life, psychologically speaking. More happened in you during those years than happened in most people's entire first act. Jung described individuation as a spiral, which matters because spirals look like circles when you're inside them. You feel like you're going around and around, hitting the same issues, the same doubts, the same stuck places. But you're ascending. Each pass takes you higher, gives you more perspective, integrates another piece of the puzzle. You only see the upward movement when you look back from above. And by that point, the circling has stopped. Something has consolidated. People who win late often describe the experience in similar terms. They say it felt like everything clicked into place, but when they look back, they can see the clicking was happening for years. They just couldn't hear it over the noise of self-doubt and social comparison. There's a specific quality that late winners share, and Jung would have traced it directly to the individuation process. They tend to be unusually unshakable. Once they've arrived at their own center, they stay there with a kind of stability that early achievers often lack. Think about it this way. Someone who succeeded early, who built their identity on talent, ambition, and social approval, is always vulnerable to the loss of those things. Take away the job title, and they don't know who they are. End the relationship, and they collapse. Challenge their worldview, and they get defensive because their worldview isn't something they arrived at through struggle. It's something they absorbed. The late winner has already lost everything, psychologically speaking. They've already been stripped of false identity. They've already sat in the darkness of not knowing who they are or what they're for. They've already faced the worst thing, the formless void that exists between shedding the persona and discovering the self. And because they've survived that, external losses hit differently. They sting, sure, but they don't destroy. There's something beneath the external structure now, and that something doesn't depend on circumstances to exist. Jung called this the self, capital S, the center of the total personality that emerges when conscious and unconscious are brought into alignment. The self is what you find at the bottom of all the searching, and once you've found it, you operate from a different place entirely. Your decisions come from deeper knowing. Your creative work has a quality of inevitability. People respond to it because it's genuine in a way that's hard to fake and impossible to manufacture. I want to talk about the loneliness of this path, because pretending it doesn't exist would be dishonest. The years of searching are lonely. You're experiencing things internally that you can't explain to the people around you. You're wrestling with questions they've either never considered or resolved quickly by just picking the conventional answer. You feel like you're speaking a different language, and in a sense, you are. The language of the inner world, the language Jung spent his career trying to map, doesn't translate easily into small talk. And even when you emerge, even when the winds start arriving, there's a loneliness that persists. You've gone somewhere most people haven't been. You see things differently. Your values are calibrated to something internal rather than external, which means you're perpetually out of step with a culture that measures everything by what's visible and quantifiable. Jung knew this loneliness intimately. He wrote about it throughout his life, the isolation that comes with consciousness, the price of seeing what others choose to ignore. He didn't offer a cure for it. What he offered instead was a reframe. The loneliness is evidence that you've gone deep enough to leave the crowd behind. It hurts, but it also means you're in territory that most people never reach. The rare ones learn to carry this. They find others who speak the same language, usually in small numbers, often unexpectedly, and those connections have a depth that compensates for their scarcity. They learn that being understood by everyone was never possible and never actually what they wanted. What they wanted was to be understood truly, and true understanding requires someone who's done their own deep work. Let me circle back to what Jung observed about the second half of life, because this is where the late winning pattern becomes unmistakable. Jung believed that the second half of life, roughly from the late 30s onward, has a fundamentally different purpose than the first. The first half is about establishing the ego, building a place in the world, creating an identity that functions socially. The second half is about meaning, depth, integration, becoming who you were before anyone told you who to be. Most people arrive at the second half unprepared. They've spent decades building an identity they never examined, and now the questions are arriving. The midlife questions, the existential questions, and they have no tools for engaging with them. This is why midlife crisis is so common and so devastating. The person has to do in a few turbulent years what the rare ones spent a decade doing gradually. The rare ones arrive at the second half prepared. The tools are already built, the self-knowledge is already acquired, the shadow has already been met and, if not fully integrated, at least acknowledged. So, instead of spending their 40s in crisis, they spend their 40s in creation. Instead of dismantling a false identity, they're building something real on the foundation they laid during all those years everyone thought they were wasting. This is the mechanism behind late winning. It's timing. The rare ones do the inner work during the phase of life when most people are doing the outer work. Then, when the outer work finally begins, it proceeds with an efficiency and authenticity that the early achievers can't match, because the early achievers are now beginning the inner work they skipped, and it's derailing everything they built. Jung saw this pattern so consistently that he considered it one of the central dynamics of psychological development. The people who looked like they were wasting time were investing in a currency the culture doesn't recognize, self-knowledge, and the returns on that investment didn't show up until the second half of life, when self-knowledge becomes the most valuable thing a person can possess. There's one more thing I want to address because it's the objection that probably lives in the back of your mind even as everything else I've said rings true. The objection goes something like this: but what if I'm not rare? What if I'm just failing? What if I'm romanticizing my own stagnation? That's a fair question, and Jung would have respected you for asking it, because the willingness to question your own narrative is itself a sign of psychological maturity. So let me offer a distinction. The difference between genuine individuation and avoidance dressed up as depth is action. The person who's truly doing the inner work is uncomfortable. They're sitting with material they'd rather avoid. They're confronting truths about themselves that aren't flattering. They're in friction with their own patterns, and that friction produces, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, change. The person who's romanticizing stagnation is comfortable. They've created a story about being too deep for the world that lets them off the hook. They use psychological language as armor. They talk about their journey without actually moving. If you're genuinely doing the work, if the years of searching have cost you something, if you've confronted aspects of yourself you wish you hadn't, if you've changed in ways that were painful, then the pattern applies to you. You're in it. The foundation is being built. The synthesis is forming. And if you suspect you might be hiding, well, the fact that you can consider that possibility honestly puts you closer to the first group than the second. Jung spent much of his later life trying to help people understand that the psyche has its own timeline. It doesn't care about your 5-year plan. It doesn't care about the milestones your culture says you should hit by 30. It operates according to an inner logic that often contradicts the outer world's demands. And if you try to override it, if you try to force your development into a shape that matches the social calendar, it pushes back. Through symptoms, through depression, through the persistent, maddening feeling that something is off, no matter how right your life looks on paper. Trusting the psyche's timeline is one of the hardest things a person can do in a culture that treats delay as defeat. Everything around you says faster, sooner, now. Your Instagram feed is full of 25-year-olds who seem to have it figured out. Your family asks questions at holidays that carry implicit deadlines. Your own inner critic, which has absorbed every external expectation you've ever encountered, tells you daily that you're falling behind. And in the middle of all that noise, something quiet in you keeps saying, wait. Keep going, but wait. The thing you're building can't be rushed. It has to be grown. That quiet voice is what Jung spent his career learning to hear in his patients. It's what he called the voice of the self, the deepest center of who you are, the part that knows things your conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. And when he traced the lives of people who listened to that voice, who trusted the slow process even when it looked like nothing was happening, he found again and again that they arrived somewhere remarkable, somewhere the fast movers rarely reached. They arrived at a life that was genuinely theirs, and they arrived with the psychological resources to actually live it. So if you're in the middle of it right now, if you're in the years that feel empty, the years where nothing seems to be working, the years where you look around and wonder why everyone else seems to know something you don't, I want to leave you with this. You're not behind, you're underneath. You're doing the subterranean work that will eventually surface, and when it surfaces, it will have roots deep enough to hold whatever grows from it. The people who peaked early built on topsoil. You're building into bedrock. It takes longer. It looks like nothing from the surface, and it holds. Jung understood this because he lived it. His most influential work came after years of isolation and confusion. His deepest insights emerged from his darkest periods. He didn't succeed in spite of the difficult years. He succeeded because of them, because those years forced a depth of self-knowledge that made everything after them more solid, more real, more lasting. Your timeline is yours. The seeds went in years ago. The soil's been doing its work in the dark, in silence, where nobody could see and nobody could measure. And something is pushing toward the surface now, even if you can't feel it yet. You'll know when it breaks through. Everyone around you will act surprised. You won't be. If you're in this process, if you're doing the deep, invisible work of becoming who you actually are, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this stage. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed for people whose path doesn't follow the standard map. It won't give you a shortcut, because there isn't one, but it'll give you a way to work with what's happening inside you instead of against it. The link's below.